Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Faculty of Social Science, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this lecture that we're about to receive from our newly appointed honorary doctor, Professor Jenny Phillimore of the University of Birmingham. My name is Kristian Daneback, and I'm the Deputy Dean. I know it says Pro-Dean in the invitation, but I think it's more modest to say Deputy Dean. Pro sounds so professional in some kind of way. The honorary doctorate, it's partly an award for past deeds, service, and collaboration with our faculty. It's a lot of contributions that we are awarding with this title. But it's also a way of formalizing our relationship, to officially strengthen the ties between us and to extend our collaboration across the faculty and into the future. And therefore, it's my pleasure to welcome you, Professor Phillimore, as an honorary member and colleague of our faculty. And I will pass on the microphone for a further introduction to Professor Gabriella Elgenius, who will be also the chair of this lecture. So, thank you, and welcome.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jenny Phillimore, who is being conferred an honorary doctorate tomorrow at the University of Gothenburg. Jenny is professor and holds a chair in migration and superdiversity at the University of Birmingham. She was the founding director of the Center for Excellence in Research in Migration and Superdiversity, called IRIS, during 2012 and 2020, so recently. I know you're not comfortable with this, but I have asked permission to just read my nomination for Jenny to the faculty. I think we need a little context, right? You're nodding, that's good. And just to say that this nomination was supported by my head of department, Anna Peixoto, and Andreas Speer, who's the director of the Center of Global Migration. Jenny Phillimore is nominated in view of her extraordinary contributions to the field of migration, integration, diversity, and collaborative research methodologies. Jenny has pioneered scholarship into integration and superdiversity and has contributed towards developing multidimensional and multidirectional approaches to integration. An integral part of her work has been to problematize existing definitions of diversity and moving away from simplistic understandings of majorities and minorities. In so doing, she has provided new analytical, more adequate tools to better understand growing complexity, increased interconnectedness across societies, multiple origins, legal status, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And the diversification of diversity is now commonly described as superdiversity. Well, I am delighted and very fortunate to work with you in several projects, and I'm delighted that the faculty has conferred this honorary degree. So Jenny, you're now going to talk to us about, and you can explain a little more perhaps about the Serida project, and the title for the lecture today is Everyday Kindness as Resistance to the Cruelty of Immigration Regimes.
Thank you very much for your kind words in your introduction and for inviting me here and conferring this doctorate, which really means an awful lot to me. I've been working in Sweden for many years now, and it feels like in a time when Britain is drifting further and further away from Europe, it's something that can bring me closer to a country that I really love working with and colleagues who I really value. So I do appreciate very much what's happening over the next couple of days. On to the the lecture. So I've been working with colleagues in Sweden, Australia, Turkey, UK. I'm trying to think if I left anywhere else. Yes. Yeah, no, that seems to be it. On a project called the Sarita Project. So the Sarita Project is a sort of acronym for sexual and gender-based violence against refugees from displacement to arrival. And it's actually funded by a Swedish funder, Riksbanken Jubilee Fund, under their Global Challenges program. And I mean, it's kind of one big project, and now it's become a whole suite of projects. And I'm moving into a phase where I'm starting a fellowship for 3 years, or I have started a fellowship 3 years, which builds on the Sarita work. So very much continues. So I've really been working on this, I think, since about 2015, 2016. And it's not an easy project to work on. You know, at the end of, it's about sexual and gender-based violence. And we have interviewed well over 200 survivors, as well as lots of people who provide services to survivors. And we've heard an awful lot of very, very difficult stories, hard to express. In fact, we don't express in words some of the things that we read, because it's very hard to find a way to sanitize them without removing the power of those stories. But in reading through, when I work on a project, and I'm the leader of a project, I will read every transcript that's produced, because I want to know what's coming out. I want to be thinking about findings, and I'm actually a social policy analyst. I'm not a sociologist, although social policy analysts, we beg and borrow from pretty much every discipline we can. But I'm really interested in, policy, practice, what policies are harmful, how they could be changed, what practices we need to engage in to try and provide better support. So, one way I could only do that by understanding what's going on out there. So I do tend to read everything. And when I was reading the Sarita data, which, is really horrific, I noticed that in amongst the cruelty, of which there is a great deal, there were these incidences of kindness recalled by survivors spontaneously. So we would ask them, is there anything that helped you along your journey, once you've arrived in Sweden, whatever? And they would cite an act, or sometimes more than one act, of kindness. And this began to turn into a pattern. And I think as a form of almost like therapy for me, I got a little bit obsessed by these kindnesses, and I started thinking, what do they mean? Are they important? So I said to the team, when we're going through the data, can you have a look, see if you can identify any more of this kindness? Is it a thing, or is it just wishful thinking on my part? And so the team did, and I'll give you the names of those who worked on it at the end. And we identified in amongst from 166 transcripts on which this particular analysis was based, 36 individuals who raised spontaneously acts of kindness that had occurred at some point in their journey. And it's reflecting on those acts of kindness, which is a completely new area for me. Apparently there's something called positive psychology out there, and I'm just kind of getting engaged with that. And kindness sometimes, is covered in positive psychology, or that you can look up kindness in education studies and peace studies. So I'm just starting to get engaged with this, and it's almost kicked off a new train of thinking, which, as you'll see when we get to the end of the presentation, is kind of bleeding over into the localities and rethinking projects that we're doing here in Sweden, led by Gabriella. So the presentation today is based on the kindness paper that I've co-written with other members of the Sarita team. And it's a little bit about the process, as well as, how this started to happen, what my thinking process is, and where we've got to with it. And certainly, I don't have any answers. I end this with more questions than answers, but at least for me, in a way, it's heading somewhere a bit more positive. And maybe, certainly, working in the UK, you need that at the moment, and I think probably in Sweden you need a bit of that as well. Right, so I've got a very technical And it works, that's good. Brand new, apparently. We don't have these in Britain. Okay, so a little bit of context. We are at a point now where there are over 100 million forcibly displaced people in the world. This is not a product of an increasing world population, and therefore, of course, the proportion of displaced people remains the same, so it goes up over time. Absolutely not. This number is well over double what it was a decade ago. Something is going on out there. We know that there are conflicts, the invasion of Ukraine, the situation in Afghanistan, but also where we're heading with the climate. You know, this is an upward trend, and there is no sign of it going downwards, unfortunately. And at the same time it's going up, we're also seeing that the flows of people, which 20 years ago would have been more masculine than feminine, are increasingly feminized. So nearly 50%, almost 50% of those who are forced to migrate now are women, and there are high numbers of children as well. So families are on the move, and we've seen a lot of this, again, particularly from Ukraine and also Afghanistan. There is work out there looking at sexual and gender-based violence. There's a lot of work looking at SGBV in conflicts, and there's quite a bit of work looking at what happens in camps. A little bit of work about what happens on the journey. But what there isn't is a great deal of work that picks up on the whole continuum of violence, which for many people starts pre-displacement and then continues into what we like to imagine, describe as refuge. And so what we've done in the Sarita project is we have worked with survivors once they're at their end point, if you like, or their end point for now, which might be in the asylum system, or maybe even they've got a failed asylum claim, their case has been rejected. Maybe they're on the streets. We spoke to a lot of Afghan boys in Sweden who had got to the end of the line with their asylum claims and were just living on the streets of Sweden. In the UK, a lot of women in this situation. And we talk to those individuals and we go back, you know, kind of a retrospective interview about how they ended up being there, the different things that have happened to them. And we ask them about moments of vulnerability, moments of resilience. We're trying to identify through looking at resilience what things could work, what do we need more of. And now we're engaged in quarterly conversations with some of the leading humanitarian organizations in Geneva, talking about how do we better address the needs of this population, because humanitarian sector works with kind of gender-based violence over there, maybe more of a development side of things, forced migration here. There's not a lot that brings the two together, so we're trying to have those conversations. And at the same time, we're trying to have an impact on policy in the UK. But you may have seen it's a bit chaotic there at the moment, so this is not a priority. And our voice, which was fairly loud last year, seems to have got much quieter. Anyway, so as I mentioned, as I was going through these transcripts, I think it was probably me in the first instance, started noticing these acts of kindness. And they were acts of kindness by strangers. And by strangers, in this presentation, I mean people who it's not their job to help a refugee or a displaced person, but they do so spontaneously because they have made the decision, they've noticed what is happening to that person, and they have decided to act. So it's an act of agency with forced migrants as recipients, and they have no duty to provide that kindness or that service or whatever to the recipient. And what I've done in this paper is ask, what is the effect of such kindnesses on individuals? And the kindnesses that we'll talk about are both extraordinary, but mostly they're fairly banal. And what's the effect on the lives of SGBV survivors? We're not in a position to ask those who performed those acts, although that would be a really interesting research project. Difficult to find respondents, no doubt. Okay, so for me, it was noticing the acts, and then I decided, okay, I'm going to start reading about how kindness has been conceptualized and used empirically, because I really didn't know. This was something completely new to me. So the first thing I found, of course, was a definition of kindness. We always look first for our definitions. And I read that kindness is an emotion. Yeah, that makes sense. But it's also a behavior. So it isn't just thinking or feeling, but it's acting. It's the act that's important. So the feeling may be one of empathy, but it's then translated into action. And I was particularly attracted to the work of Magnet et al., who talked about kindness as the ability to not only feel, but to bear the vulnerability of others. Okay, one has to feel the pain or the need of the other person in order to identify what act is necessary. And that process for me is the process of performing a kindness. Now, on the whole, the literature says that kindness is beneficial for the recipient. So it should be something that improves their situation in a positive way. That's generally the thinking in the kindness literature. Although, as you'll see as we move forward, that is not always the case. Kindness has a dark side, if you like. So it has a potential dark side, but on the whole, it's an act that improves matters, maybe just in the moment for the recipient. But reading Magnet et al., I find that also it's got the potential to go beyond the improvement in the moment to reshape power relations and to resist oppressive practices, and to do so from the bottom up. Reading through this, I started to encounter the idea of everyday, which I've used quite extensively in other work around integration that you might be more familiar with. I looked at everyday kindness. And in terms of everyday, I kind of picked up on the work of Lefebvre, talking about every day as a lens for analysis of society, how things play out, the everyday actions as a way of enabling social change, securing maybe a complete change, a rupture in social relations from the bottom up, but also maybe for reinforcing those social relations. I mean, certainly the everyday is a powerful lens for analysing power relations and the potential of everyday to make a change. And in this way, maybe kindness can be political. So I started to think maybe I should look at kindness as an everyday act, maybe kindness as a micro-political act. And in terms of our data, the majority of the acts were banal. So they were kind of everyday actions, although, as you'll see, there were some that were extraordinary. So then I started to look at kindness as a micro-political act, focusing on Deleuze and Guattari's work, which again we've used in the UpWeb project, which was also had a site in Sweden. And here we're looking at micropolitics as a sort of the kind of power and maintenance of relationships that might be racialized, they might be gendered, and they are embedded through everyday encounters. I also focus on micro-political tactics, the idea that very small strategies, which can be subconscious or they can be conscious acts of resistance, can resist control. And this seemed to have some potential in a project that's looking at resistance and resilience from the perspective of SGBV survivors. I was then drawn to peace studies, which has focused on the micro-political quite a lot, and the work of Benedict Anderson. There's a great little sort of editorial statement where he's talking about, peace is negotiated at the kind of high table, if you like, but it's lived and it's enacted at the everyday. So if you think of, a war zone, or you think of a place that's recovering from war, you think about Rwanda, for example, and the Hutus and the Tutsis, the way that peace occurred was from the bottom up, by those enmeshment of individuals who, for many months, had been in conflict in a really major way. So it's their living together, they're being able to rub alongside each other without it erupting into conflict, that is the real enactment of peace. And he refers to the actions of people in the everyday as the practices of the possible. So if we can live like this, then surely up there where all these decisions and negotiations are occurring, they can make it happen. And I really like this idea of the practices of the possible. And then finally, looking at Clark, I encounters emotions, the idea that emotions can mark and claim place and can be these kind of micro-political strategies for change. So the micro-political side of things can be something that happens at a group level, but it's very much about the actions of individuals. All of us can engage in micro-political acts. So, the practices of the possible suggested hope. And I moved into looking at hope and kindness. These two seem to be coming up together. And I read that, and I hadn't come across this in 23 years of working on forced migration, that forced migration can be described in itself as an act of hope, because you're moving from one dire situation in the hope that you're going to arrive somewhere better and have a safer, better life. I'm not sure why I hadn't thought of it that way before, but increasingly I'm attracted to the idea of hope in the work that I'm doing more generally, particularly the stuff on civil society with Gabriella, where there are strong signs of the importance of hope and the need in certain situations to reinstall hope when hopelessness dominates. So forced migration is driven by hope, because why would you move if you think things are not going to be better? Even if it's just a tiny bit, even if that means the difference between eating and not eating, living and not living. So it is hope. But hope's ephemeral, as we all know. It's there one minute, it's gone the next. It can be maybe reinstalled through an act of kindness, but it can disappear. And I read through Kleist and Thorson that hope is a way of offering a route to overcoming uncertainty. And I've written quite a bit about uncertainty in relation to forced migration and the way that, the kind of act of violent uncertainty, the way that states keep individuals in kind of stasis for weeks, months, years, sometimes decades. Are they going to be safe? Will they have to be returned? Maybe it can overcome that uncertainty. Will I make it across the border? Will I be safe tonight? This kind of uncertainty can be overcome by hope to some extent. And then I found this idea of radical hope, and radical hope being the kind of hope that you have in the face of everything that tells you it's hopeless. So, and you need radical hope as a forced migrant, with all the dreadful things that happen to you on the route, to be able to say, okay, tomorrow I will walk again through the desert in the heat with no water, okay, because there is some hope that I will reach safety ultimately. And radical hope is basically generated through this focus on the everyday. So again, I find myself asking, well, okay, everyday kindnesses, would they generate radical hope? Then I'm finding from Solnit that kindness, this is in kind of urban studies, can, in areas that are really vulnerable, maybe really deprived, the acts of kindness can disrupt the social norms in those areas and offer hope. But I also found, and this is the dark side, a little bit on the dark side of kindness, that kindness can erode agency. So kindness may suggest dependency. If you're enforcing kindness on someone, or if they have no choice but to accept that kindness and they become dependent on it, then you take away their agency completely. And there's a great piece of work by Victoria Canning, and she's looking, I don't know if any of you know this, but she's looking at detention centres in Sweden. And what she finds is in these detention centres, the guards, or whatever you want to call them, the officers there, they befriend the forced migrants, the refugees, or asylum seekers, or failed asylum seekers, whatever you want to call them. They befriend them in order to control them. So it's a kind of soft power. You know, if they like me, they're not going to kick back against me. So they use kindness to actually control. So this is the dark side here. Okay. So how did we collect data? A little bit about that. You know, it's kind of normal in these situations that we talk a little bit about the methods that we used. So I've mentioned it's a Sarita project, and I'm only using the data from 5 countries. We also have data on Poland, Ukraine, England and Wales. No, Wales and Scotland, sorry. So for this particular paper, we looked at 166 transcripts of survivors. More information is available about the survivor interviews for those who are interested in the sample, but we didn't interview anybody under the age of 18, although important to note that for many, the act of SGBV or the acts of SGBV occurred when they were children or young women or young boys. And the oldest people we spoke to were over 70. So there's quite an age range there. The majority under 40, the majority were female, which in fact reflects, unfortunately, the reality of SGBV, but 35 were male. And they had a whole range of different forced migration statuses. So we chose initially those 5 countries because they've got different immigration, asylum, welfare, and gender regimes. So, of course, you know, kind of the feminist social policy, I don't know where that's going to be going over the next few years in Sweden, and, you know, really strong welfare sector that looks after, you know, that supports women's rights and, you know, pushes back against interpersonal violence and intimate partner violence, you know, was a distinctive feature of Sweden that interested us. You have a lot of asylum seekers coming to Sweden and the UK, more resettlement in Australia. So lots of different variables amongst all of those. We recruited people, we paired up with NGOs. So when we work with NGOs, we don't just knock on the door and say, hi, can you help us get some respondents? You know, we need people to interview. We actually try to co-develop the projects, and they are a paid partner. You know, because if you're constantly knocking at the door of NGOs, they're already massively overstretched in a lot of countries. So that's quite exploitive, and, you know, power dynamics there are already quite tricky. So we worked with our partner NGOs who identified some people for us. And we also been working in this space for a long time. So we used our networks, we used social media, and we used snowballing. So we asked respondents if they knew of anyone else who might want to be interviewed. And then what we did is we interviewed in their chosen language. So we employed a lot of multilingual researchers. And where we were unable to speak a language, we paid for an interpreter from the NGO. Really important to get the interpreters right in these situations, because often the interpreter is from the same community as the person you're talking to. And shame and stigma, we have a paper that was published a few months ago on this, are a huge factor here. So, of course, no one's going to want to share in those situations, and it would be unethical to expect them to. Mostly we recorded, so we've got these massive long transcripts. And then, of course, really tricky thing, not only were we paid in krona, but we had to convert that to pounds, to Australian dollars and all sorts of things. We also had so many different languages going on, so we had to translate everything into English so that we actually had some common data that we could work on. And then we analysed the data in a software program using like shared codes, which I oversaw, and then we've done some very specific coding around the particular issues that we've identified. So in this case, once I started identifying kindness as an issue, I asked the team, which is over 20 people, who wants to work on this with me? Some people stepped up and said, yeah, I do, so I'm really interested. And then we all went in, asked some more questions of our already coded data. So we kind of recoded. And then we found this 36 people who spontaneously shared these stories of kindness. just a couple of words on the ethics. You might want to ask some questions about after. I mean, this is an ethical minefield. It's an absolute nightmare to work in, both for those that you're interviewing, but also for those who do the interviews. So we really had to put some very strong practices in place. Very fortunate that our Australian team were able to provide a lot of training and a lot of experience in this space. So very grateful to them for their assistance. Okay, so I'm moving on to the kindness, and I think the first thing I really need to do is just to give you a hint of, you know, the fact that kindness here, what we're talking about is kindness that occurs in the face of cruelty. I put cruelty in the title, and, you know, there is no other way of describing what occurs to our survivors than cruelty. And this cruelty comes in many, many forms. Of course, there's the physical and the sexual violence, which is the kind of obvious stuff, well, should be the headline hitting stuff, especially the scale that it's on. But, you know, it tends to be more of the headlines. But underneath that, there is a kind of hidden cruelty, which is the doing nothing, the looking away. And this is something that, you know, maybe we're not guilty of, but most people are guilty of. You know, in this situation, 100 million displaced people, and, you know, we want to park those people out of sight because we don't want to observe their suffering. And there's 3 types of violence that, you know, the kind of hidden violences. There's this Lucy Mabelin's slow violence of the everyday, and this is basically scraping to survive, everyday suffering. Will you have enough food? Will you be able to feed your children? Will you have somewhere to sleep out of the sun or out of the rain? Constant scrabbling and searching just to survive. So I'd strongly recommend Lucy Mabelin's work on that. And, you know, we've used this idea of the slow violence every day and the realities of the lived experiences of survivors. But there's also an idea around, you know, violent abandonment. I like Schindler's work on this. The idea is that when you see suffering, you ignore it. So a great example is those refugees who are stuck in camps throughout Europe, where there's no state intervention, there's no state support, nobody is providing housing, sanitation. In fact, we know that in those camps, they are not safe in health terms, and they're certainly not safe for women and children. You know, these are often the site of rape and other sexual abuses. Or it's the kind of inaction that we engage in once someone's had their asylum claim rejected, and we just kind of chuck them out of the system. They don't leave. We know that they're still here, but we don't give them anything. We make sure that their life is as tough as possible. You know, and it's about what I'm sure you've heard of, the hostile environment in the UK. This is a form of violent abandonment. And then finally, I already mentioned the violent uncertainty, the denial of ontological security. You know, the fact that people have no idea where their life is going and when it's going to get there. Okay, and here's the tricky bit, the continuum of SGBV. Now, you should have this, and I'm not suggesting you read it in depth now, but what we did in the Sarita project, we have hundreds, over 300 stories, unfortunately, of these very complex experiences. So if you were to read the literature around SGBV in forced migration, you would kind of think that it's something that happens here or there. But actually, what we're talking about is an individual, the same person who experiences multiple incidents of sexual and gender-based violence, the physical, the sexual, but also those invisible violences over time. Could be all their life, could be from the age of 3 up until their ongoing existence in Sweden or the UK. And this violence is experienced at the hands of multiple perpetrators. What the Sarita project showed me is that there are predators everywhere. You know, they are the people that are meant to keep you safe sometimes. They are your fellow migrants. They are your family. They are strangers. So here we have a representation of the sexual and gender-based violence continuum. The one I've shown you here, how it works basically. This is created by a values-based cartoonist who used our data to generate these images. In the middle, in the center bit, you've got life in the country of origin and the incident or incidents that led someone to leave. They had to leave. This is the having to leave. And then, this might be my opportunity to use the special pointer. Oh, no. Should not have tried that. Oh, look. So here we have in the middle, this is the experiences that lead to forced migration. This is the departure. And then this is the bit that many people don't understand. So this woman from Eritrea, she first ends up in Sudan, and then wherever she is, she experiences some form of violence. So she has to move. So she goes from Sudan to Turkey. Maybe I'll be safe in Turkey. No, not safe in Turkey. Off she goes to Greece. In this instance, she's hiding in the woods. And unfortunately, some boys find her and she's raped there. Then she ends up in France. It happens again. By now, she's using transactional sex to survive. She's been raped so many times along the route. It becomes something that's kind of expected by the time you get this far along. Then she ends up in a refrigerated lorry. She's told she's going to Canada. She's never been to school. She doesn't know the geography of the world. She doesn't know that the lorry can't take her to Canada. She doesn't know it's a refrigerated lorry. When she gets out at the end, she's actually white with cold. She says she nearly died. And then up here, you have the kind of structural violences of the asylum system. Anyway, I'll leave you can take those away with you if you want. They're not the happiest of documents, but it was our way of being able to demonstrate, to kind of express to people the complexity of experiences. And the reason that people move is not because, I'm looking for somewhere better. I'm looking for somewhere less bad. It's that hope that I talked about. Okay. Now let's move to kindness. Sorry, I'll move away from the really depressing stuff, because there is hope and there is kindness. And I've got 4 slides on kindness, or four types of effect of kindness that we have observed in the data. And you remember I talked about the potential for kindness to cause a rupture. We found 12 examples where women were helped to escape from very exploitative situations where they had been kidnapped and imprisoned. So when you're on the journey, there are places that are super dangerous. Some of them, sometimes they're called rape camps, sometimes they're called torture camps, and you get stuck in these places until you escape, die, or someone pays a ransom so that you can get out. And those are the 3 ways out. And what we found that in some instances, the oppressors in these kind of places where a particular kind of heteropatriarchal relation is seen as norm, is normalized, would sometimes I noticed that someone was sick, she's sick, and they would smuggle this woman out and they would take her to the border, because it's no good just releasing them in the country or just chucking them outside the rape camp, because they will be recaptured, because the gangs who work these are everywhere. So would actually, at great personal risk to themselves, risk of violence, would help those people escape the country and cross the border. We also saw examples where individuals had escaped and were helped to shelter by local women who also could have really faced an awful lot of trouble. So one woman, she was raped and left for dead by police in Libya. She was rescued by a local woman who took her into her house for a month, who used all kinds of medication to address her wounds, who fed her, and then paid for her to leave Libya on a boat heading to Italy. So, I mean, you think of all the politics around these small boats and how terrible they are. Think of what that woman was escaping. The boat was a better option than staying. Anyhow, so this woman who doesn't know her does all this for her. So we see extreme examples in these kind of ruptures where courage and kindness come together, and they completely shatter the social norms around control, around exploitation and abuse, and they save lives. There's a particular example I'll give you here in a moment anyway. The other thing I should say is that, acts of kindness were observed all the way across the continuum of violence, and we saw a lot of examples of when people were in refuge where complete strangers intervened when they saw intimate partner violence. So things like going into a neighbour's house and the neighbour would drag the woman in and say, right, this is what you need to do. They weren't friends with this neighbour. So someone was given $500 by a complete stranger and told to run, go here, use this money, find yourself somewhere to live. Total strangers. But the example of Samia and what happened to her, I think, is a really great example of the courage that can be associated with kindness. So Samia is married to a very high up Taliban officer, if that's the right way of putting it, and has been very severely beaten for many, many years. He then tells her that he's going to marry her 12-year-old daughter, or their 12-year-old daughter, to another Taliban commander. And at this point, she decides, and this is often the catalyst for flight, that she's going to run. She does not want this happening to her daughter. So she crosses borders, and she's in Iran, and she checks into a hostel for the night. And the brother-in-law turns up, the brother of this commander, and he turns up with a gun, and he wants to take her, he wants to kill her, and take the children back. So she says the owner of the hostel took his gun away and told him to leave for the night and come back the next morning and take the children back. After he left, I talked to the owner of the hostel and told him that my husband brother would kill me if they let him take me and my children. I asked them to take me to Turkey. They put me and my children in a truck and asked me where to go. So they take her to the border, they hide her under a load of bags, and she escapes. They know this guy, she doesn't pay him, she has nothing. They know he's going to be back the next day with the gun, but this is the kind of, so we see a lot of examples of this kind of thing. These are the extraordinary that I would refer to. Okay, next we have kindness and hope. I think I probably need to speed up a bit as well. There's so many stories, but I'll try not to go into them in too much depth. Kindness, as I talked about as a possibility, we did see examples of where kindness could install hope. But it's worth fronting this up with a statement: there is a risk of accepting kindness. Because we also saw examples of where someone was offered some help and they end up being kidnapped, they end up being robbed, they end up being raped. So this is, kindness in the context of very few other choices. We saw lots of examples. So an individual might tell us of 3 times that her life was, or she was given hope by being given food, by given shelter, by given clothes, shelter from the sun, shelter from the rain, whatever. Walking through deserts, particularly where water is in short supply, and someone gets sick, that the local people come up to you, they give you water, they give you medicine, and they enable you to cross the deserts. Without that, you wouldn't be able to go forward. We also heard about kindness in refuge, the kinds of advice, guidance, sustenance that people are offered in a spontaneous, random kind of way, actually enable people to think, I could have a life here. There are nice people here. That would install that kind of hope. So you've got the hope about moving forward, being able to continue a journey, maybe getting somewhere safe, but you also had the hope that maybe I could make a new life. So kindness in these instances was life-enforcing and sometimes life-saving. We also find examples of where kindness reinstills someone's sense of self-worth. Now you imagine months, years of degradation. One woman said to us, where I come from, women are worth less than your shoe. So really never had any sense of self-worth, always been told that they are inferior and worthless. Not every woman, but we did see a number of instances where this was the case. So you might have months, years, decades, a whole life of degradation. And over time, this erodes people's belief in humanity and in themselves, that they are worth saving, that anybody would actually want them anywhere. And we see this fantastic example. I think this is the one that has upset me more than any other. The example of Sinead, a Nigerian woman who is escaping sexual and gender-based violence, which she's experienced in her own country through forced prostitution. She's been kidnapped, she's been imprisoned, but she's made it with a bunch of other forced migrants into Hungary. And this is the time when Viktor Orban has, kind of whipped up a frenzy about refugees and how they're going to, they're a security risk to Hungarian culture and to Hungarian safety. And you've got a whole bunch of people at the border, some who are supporting refugees, some who are saying go back, throwing things at them, throwing insults. You've got the newspapers there. It's all happening. You've got loads of police. And it's actually illegal in Hungary to help these refugees. Sinead has been walking for months. She is filthy. She has no sanitary products, and she said, I felt no better than an animal. And I kept going up to people and saying, please help me, give me some clothes, help me. And people just turned away from her. And then this incredible woman, it still makes me, comes up to her, and basically she's crying, this lady, and she says to her, have my trousers. Sorry. Oh no, we're recording this. So she gives her trousers, and this, noticing of the pain of others, not looking away. This woman cannot do much more than she does. She's surrounded by police in a really politically charged situation. But what she does, the kindness and compassion that she offers Sinead, made her feel, I am worthy of someone's love. I'm worthy of moving forward. And this kind of made me realise, in relation to kindness, I was thinking about this the other day when I was like chopping away, making my soup. I noticed that, kind of like, kindness, first of all, it's about noticing the suffering of others. And you think of all the suffering that's going on around us, all the things that our border regimes are doing at this time, our governments are doing and saying, and these are the people who notice. They actually don't turn away. It doesn't become the norm for them. They open up to others' vulnerability, just as Magna et al. Said, and they act. And this rekindles the belief of the recipients of the kindness in humanity. We saw other examples. The right to be myself, particularly in Sweden. Trans woman, she's in a class, I don't know what the class was, and she says to her, she's always been beaten and rejected because of her gender identity. And she tells her class, I am trans, okay? And they all stand up and applaud her. And in that moment, she realizes she's got a right to be herself, and there's something good about who she is. So they celebrate this identity that she's thought of as illicit. We also saw examples where a demonstration of love from a complete stranger, I'll come and visit you, tell me where you live, I'll be your friend. For people who have repeatedly attempted suicide, they'd say, I've got a reason to live now because somebody cares about me. Okay, bit of the dark side stuff. I just want to say, the story, of course, here is very negative, but the story around kindness is mostly positive. There were only a handful, I think 4 incidents, if you like, or 4 respondents who told us about the dark side. And part of this is that kind of conditionality of kindness. So there's a woman, she's escaping a very abusive relationship. A friend of a friend puts her up, and she's living in their house, and they keep asking her to leave, but she's got nowhere to go. So she cries, they let her stay a bit longer, and eventually, this kind of, the kindness that she's experiences emphasizes her dependency, and to some extent extends the violence of uncertainty, because she doesn't know when the kindness is going to be withdrawn. And she says, look, what should I do? I feel bad when I think about this. Sometimes I can't sleep. I stay up till morning. She's living with this kind of kindness hanging over her. And then the other incidences, which are a bit more common, is the kinds of kindness that are offered in pity or to control. Self-identifying Arab women, and a lot of this in these examples were in Sweden, talking about, they think I'm oppressed. So they offer us kindness because they're trying to rescue us. And they disempower us by doing this because they objectify and essentialize us. Okay. That's the findings. And I'll try and whip through the discussion. So what use is kindness? Is it just a bunch of random acts that have a, make you feel good when you're doing it and maybe help someone out? Certainly we saw lots of examples of everyday kindness, and I think this kind of bottom-up lens is really useful, and it helps us to understand the potential, at least, as Anderson says, to push back against kind of normalized treatment of migrants. But we also see it as a rupture from cruelty, this distortion of these kind of hegemonic power dynamics, a rupture from heteropatriarchal hierarchies, a pushback against the cruelty of bordering and the unkindness of racism, and that's a bit of an understatement. We also saw that kindness did enable that radical hope that in all of these awful circumstances, we can continue, we can keep moving. The hope of surviving another day, the hope of building a new life, the hope of being your true self. So yeah, lots of really good stuff there that goes, I think, beyond the individual and that momentary act of kind of exchange between actor and recipient. But we also saw that, it can be an element of self-disempowerment resulting from feelings of dependency. I think what kindness also does is it highlights this context of abandonment, because kindness is occurring in a vacuum left by the humanitarian sector, by states who fail to act or indeed even do the opposite. So it's a pushback against degrading acts, against the hostile immigration regime and the difficult circumstances that people find themselves in, where they have to make pragmatic decisions. And to this, my co-author Lisa Goodson said we should refer to adaptive preferences. The fact is, the decision to accept that kindness happens in the absence of formal protection and support. So in a way, these acts of kindness visibilize the cruelty that is going on out there in our countries, all over the world, in relationships, all kinds of places, through actually noticing what's happening, through not turning away, through having a feeling that's related to that notice and then turning that feeling into action. And I don't know what the long-term implications of this are, but I do feel that again, I return to this idea of bearing others' vulnerability. That's essential, the not turning away, because you can turn away, it's easier. The not thinking this is not your problem, double negative, sorry about that, and noticing the cruelty of border regimes, or noticing the cruelty of the heteropatriarchal relationships in which you've been raised. They often occur in abandonment, but can they generate change? So what use is kindness? Well, obviously a lot more work needed in this space. It seems like the human-to-human connection that occurs through this act of exchange generates solidarity, and that maybe the solidarity brings the strength to confront hostile systems. The woman who gave Sinead the trousers, she's confronting the thing that's going on around her. And, I think it's important to emphasize it's a choice to be kind. You can choose to be kind, you can choose to ignore something. It depends on looking at and not away from cruelty, which is sometimes very hard. And by the time I got here, I was getting a bit, very romantic and, kind of optimistic, which I needed to. But I was thinking about the butterfly effect and how small things can make a difference, because a lot of the things that occur are very small. So am I over-romanticizing kindness? Yes. Is it a sticking plaster over the gaping wound of conflict, forced migration, bordering, heteropatriarchy? Yes. But after reading 200 scripts detailing the most unimaginable cruelty, the stories of kindness at least gave me some hope. So how can we build on this? We need to start doing more research. Of course, all academics say that at the end, sorry. It's so predictable. No more research is needed, definitely not. So do some more research. Obviously, it would be great to engage with the actors, to try to understand their motives, to try to understand the conditions that facilitate kindness, because I genuinely believe that if more people noticed what was going on and didn't turn away, it would potentially make a difference. So observing cruelty, responding kindly, offers a starting point. My question to you is the starting point to what? And the final slide. almost final slide, but final slide that I'm going to talk about. That's the end of Sarita, you'd be pleased to know. But, you know, I've been thinking a lot about kindness, and I've been chopping a lot of vegetables this summer, which has been really good. Lots of courgettes and stuff, making soup and stuff, and I'm thinking about kindness, and I'm thinking, yep, so the localities and the rethinking integration projects, which Gabriella leads in vulnerable communities in Sweden, but also in the UK. Here we've been looking at the kinds of civil society action that comes out of these areas. What kinds of things happen there? Why do they happen? And Gabriella's done these amazing, really lengthy interviews with people where they've told her basically, you know, right from the beginning how this started. And you saw, I think the picture that came with this, that was a picture Gabriella took, is actually, we've got all of the transcripts spread around your nice room in sociology, the one with the nice wallpaper. And we're noticing, you know, kind of looking at, well, what's the motivation for action here? And we identified that often the civil society actions occurring in these places actually begin with the observance of other people's suffering. So again, it's this noticing and not looking away. And then the what can I do to make things better? The offer of care and compassion. That's what happens. We've got a great example. There's loads of great examples, and hopefully you'll be seeing them in some of our papers soon. They're being cooked up rather nicely, as you know, not at the moment, but been presenting them all over Europe this summer, and some are nearly ready to be submitted. The conceptual paper's already in print. But there's one great example. It's an intergenerational women's group. Here we have kids of 12, 13, 14, young women who look around their neighborhood and they see first-generation migrant women, the grannies, the aunties, looking really, really sad, and they're unwell. And they're, you know, what can we do to make their lives better? You know, it's kind of the opposite to what we might expect of teenagers, but they observe, they notice the suffering of these older women, and they act. They act in so many different ways. You'll be hearing much more about this at a later time. But what we see is that the kindnesses that they enact actually do become micro-political, and they start overturning the stigma associated with the area, and they highlight the practices of the possible. And then the state looks and says, something can work in these areas. We might be able to do something like this. And they pick up the model. So maybe that's my hope, that's the indication that these small acts can lead to maybe structural change. Anyway, watch this space. And just finally, here are the lovely co-authors, Lisa Goodson, Anna Papuzzi, Sandra Pertek, Janine Harani, and Anna Perez Aronson. I'm sure she's based in Uppsala. And if you want to look at, there's so much stuff about Sarita. There's all these images, there's films, there's all kinds of things. Just Google Sarita Birmingham, and you can find all kinds of materials, including policy briefs aimed at humanitarian acts and all sorts. Anyway, thank you for bearing with me that time.
Thank you. Should we sit here? Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you for bringing this important material to us. I think you are not the only one who feel very touched by this. And the analysis of hardship and suffering, of course. I mean, I could not think of a more timely topic to raise at this particular point in time. I think the nature of suffering that you have sort of also brought to our attention in a systematic way, and the remedies and the impact about kindness and compassion that is observed across this continuum of violence, be it structural, everyday, or slow violence. Thank you very much. I think also the important point is the impact of kindness and compassion, and the choice to observe suffering and to choose to be kind, I think is a very powerful message. Thank you very much. If you want to read something more about this particular talk. There is something that was recently released in Dagens, etc. Yeah, both about Jenny's talk and also about our civil society work. So, I mean, I have 2 questions. Maybe I can start with them, but then, of course, we invite the floor. But I was just thinking as I was sitting here, and I was thinking about the actions, but also about the actors. Do we need to, or is it important to distinguish between kindness, compassion, and conviviality, for example, was one thing I was thinking about. And the other thing was the nature of the actors. Is it important, or to what degree is it important that they are strangers? Or that's, I mean, is it important? That's something that I wanted to ask you.
Okay, 2 questions there then. I suspect compassion, maybe alongside empathy, are these kind of precursor feelings to, you remember I said like noticing, feeling, and then acting. So I think that compassion, empathy are part of that process. So the first is the noticing, and then it's having some kind of feeling response, some kind of emotional response. And the not noticing, in a way, is blocking out that emotional response. Because if you feel it, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable, and turning away might be uncomfortable. So, you know, I genuinely think that people have kind of zoned out to a greater extent the evident cruelties of bordering processes in our countries and the kinds of cruelties that are observed on an everyday basis when people are on these journeys. But if they do feel compassion, if they do feel empathy, that's when they are much more likely to feel the need to act. So I think they're much the same in a way. They're just part of that process. Conviviality is generally, it's not so much a feeling, maybe it's a way of, you know, it's been presented as a way of interacting. You know, the idea that a certain way of being together, indifference, for example, which I'm not sure speaks necessarily to this particular situation. And conviviality maybe suggests more even power relations as well, which we certainly, I mean, there's no doubt about it. You know, across all of these examples, there are major power dynamics on. It's basically, once you see someone giving something to somebody else, there's always an uneven power dynamic. Does the nature of the actors matter? Does it matter whether they're strangers or not?
So I was thinking, is it the acts or is it the actors or the combination?
Yeah. I would need to do more research on that. It's a typical academic answer. But actually, I have a wonderful PhD student, Gabriella Elgenius, and she's been doing a comparison of 2 refugee support schemes in the UK. So one is the VPRS, the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme, and basically this is where refugees go to a local authority who employ caseworkers who provide them with integration support. The other is community sponsorship, where community members volunteer, come together and offer a range of support, you know, so that kind of voluntary basis. And what she's picked up through her fieldwork, which she's done now, is the difference between the 2 is that those who are paid to do the work do it within certain boundaries, but those who volunteer do it through care. So I think there might be something in there that, you know, the self-worth is about feeling someone cares about you. And in her work, she finds that those who are part of community sponsorship feel that there's always someone there for them, whereas the ones who are not know that, you know, these are the times I can talk to them and they don't have any backup. So that suggests to me that not having an obligation to do something is more powerful when it's experienced in terms of self-worth and so on. That said, people who do work in caseworker roles, of course, often go above and beyond and do show care.
Yes, yes.
So it's not a binary in that way.
No, which we've also seen in our material.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, if somebody wants to ask a question in Swedish, please do so, and I'll do my best to translate. Andrea, you had a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jenny, for inspiring. Thank you, Jenny, for a very inspiring talk. I think that the concept of kindness can be used in many research areas, and I was thinking related to my own research area, which is the encounters between street-level bureaucrats, caseworkers, and migrants. We actually have some findings that supports your findings as well, and this is that even in the cases when street-level bureaucrats, they made a decision that went against the needs of the migrants had a tendency to accept the decision if they were treated in a kind way.
Yeah.
With the compassion, and we also assume that this act of compassion and they were like treated as a humans, like the whole human being, because they repeated this very often in their interviews. We want to be treated as a human being. We don't want to be treated in the collective level, like the migrant as a group. That this also gave them certain amount of agency. They felt really like strengthened, and we can really see this in our data. But we never thought to think about or to use the kindness as a concept, and I think that we will actually go back to this literature and to see if we can interpret the behavior of the street-level bureaucrats through kindness. So thank you for that. I was really like very, very inspired. And my question is more like related to the agency. And I would like to ask you, I don't know if you have the answer on that, because this is all like preliminary results that you have, but can you distinguish different kinds of agency that migrants have because they perceive this kind treatment? I mean, in relation to their future like visions of their place in the society or the new country of origin, or I mean, if they are strengthened in a way that they are like more confident and they will turn to other actors to ask for more help or guidance in their migration process or integration process or whatever. So what kind of agency forms we can...
Types of agencies.
Types of agencies. Thank you, Gabriella.
Okay, thank you. Your work sounds really interesting, and I think that it would certainly be a great space to look at kindness a bit more. But again, you might have a bit of a situation here where there's a bit of soft power going on. You know, if I deliver this blow in a very kind, compassionate way, maybe they're going to give me less trouble. I don't know. I mean, so you would probably need to explore the motivations of individuals for delivering the message in that way, and whether they would even tell you, of course, is another matter. Yeah, in terms of agency, certainly once our respondents were in a country of refuge, we saw that in the case of the trans woman, this celebration of her identity and her coming out actually really gave her agency to say, I can be this person, I don't need to hide anymore. So that was really, really clear. There were also quite a number of incidents, which I didn't touch upon, where individuals experienced racism in the supermarket, in the GP surgery, whatever, and sometimes by like a stranger, another customer, but sometimes by the person behind the desk or the till or whatever. And a random stranger would intervene and say, hang on a sec, that's not acceptable. You shouldn't be speaking to him, her like this. And it made, when this happened once, twice, 3 times, it actually, people told us how it made them feel that they had a right to be in public space. And I've certainly seen in other research where those who've experienced multiple incidents of racism have started to avoid certain spaces. Okay, I don't go there because when I go there, this happens. Or even to the extent as I leave my house as little as possible. I go out once a week. This was an example of one of the interviews we did in Wales, very rural area. She said, I go out once a week, I pick up my food, I come in because everybody stares at me and I don't feel I've got a right to be there. So I think we do see that in some situations, but in others, you know, it's this, you know, when the kindness that you're receiving is so important, you know, it's the thing that keeps you alive and you're never going to see that person again. It almost feels like luck. And one of our co-authors, Sandra Pertek, she's written, or we've co-authored a paper on faith, and she's written loads on faith. So she's just completed her PhD on it. And often we find that when those interventions happen, rather than it empowering someone, it's more that God is looking out for me today. You know, because this whole thing is a test from God, bit of a generalization, but you know, so this is a good sign. And so it might buoy you up and it might give you that hope, but I don't think it really empowers you, and I don't think it does much for your agency, and you certainly are never going to ask anyone for help. So that's a bit of a lengthy answer, sorry.
We have Oksana.
I had
you
myself first,
have,
but maybe I should...
No. Why don't you? I'm sure Oksana will let you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for your engaging and interesting and horrific talk here. I found myself relate quite often to my work on bullying and bystanders because I saw a lot of similarities there. And I came to wonder, because you are describing here acts of kindness, acts of ignorance, but also acts of meanness. So apparently the whole dynamic of human being, that's not that flattering, to say the least. I wonder how much of this could also, I mean, maybe that's a choice to be kind, maybe that's a choice to be mean, but is there also something that's related to personality traits? I mean, personality, psychology, that could explain that some people are able to turn away, are able to be mean to a human being in need, while someone can just stand watching some other people suffering and act.
That could be a factor. I really don't know because we didn't interview the actors. But I mean, it would be something that would bear examination. Certainly we know that some people have a greater tendency towards empathy than others. And one would expect that those who have those, you know, empathy superpowers or whatever you want to call them, might be the people who would not be able to switch off their emotions and would then feel compelled to act. But that's exactly the kind of thing that would bear further examination. In our situation, I think it'd be really hard to find those kind people. Certainly the ones on the route, the ones who even risk their own lives. But maybe, you know, somewhere like Sweden and the UK, the kind of work that Gabriella's been doing, for example, not this Gabriella, my PhD student Gabriella, would, you know, you might be able to go to those who have been kind and trying to explore those issues, maybe. Or maybe it would be a big psychological examination with vignettes. You know, you can use vignettes to see how people would respond, and then you could test them against personality types. I'm not a psychologist, but I think there's a lot of space for psychologists here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Oksana?
So interesting connection there to the bystander, I think. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Jenny. Your talk actually touched me on many different levels, both as an academic but also very much personally. As an academic, I think that what I'm grateful for is your nuanced theoretization of kindness, because I'm very happy that you include this darker side. I'm experiencing myself, and I feel that we shouldn't forget about the darker side of kindness. And here I think about the possible links between, for example, kindness and hospitality, where there is a great research on showing that, okay, different societies and different countries and different people can expose a lot of hospitality, but sometimes there are limits, and these limits are very much felt by those people who experience hospitality in the beginning. But my questions are, the first one is, what, if any, reactions or thoughts have you received if you present your research for policymakers, for those people who actually work with writing up the policies of migration policies on the local, on the government level? And the second question is, what would be your advice when it comes to training interviewers, so to say, for a study which is very much loaded by the type of suffering and war experience that you have also described? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have presented our findings extensively, so in the House of Lords, and they've been discussed by the government publicly, and can be identified in Hansard and so on. So they've definitely been talking about it. And in relation to the Homes for Ukraine scheme, we had massive concerns in the early stages about safeguarding, because it was just so, it's not ideal at all, but so we definitely engaged in conversations as they were putting the Homes for Ukraine scheme together to try and make that safer, to ensure that kind of random men couldn't just attract women from Ukraine and Poland. So we've had some traction there. I've spoken to over 40 MPs and members of the House of Lords about our findings. Some of them have been very receptive. So, for example, Jess Phillips, who is in opposition, but she leads around violence against women, is very much supporting taking our findings and using them to shape some of the rules around migration and domestic violence. But on the whole, at the moment, the British situation is really chaotic. We've been working consistently to try to shape the Victims Bill in the UK to ensure that it covers all migrants, and we made fantastic progress, and then you know what happened. So at the moment, we're not even talking to people because it is utter chaos. So we're focusing very much on the humanitarian sector in Geneva. Sandra was on... she had what's the word? Like a kind of internship, but it's definitely not an internship, but a placement. So she went to one of the major humanitarian agencies and basically looked at their work in this space where forced migration and GBV overlap, and then has prepared a set of guidelines that, once agreed, will go out to over 170 different countries. So, they've kind of listened, they're interested, and a lot of people are talking to us. But what we're realising is in places like the UK, things can happen overnight or not at all. But in the humanitarian sector, it's all really, really, really slow. So, and, you have to be in it for a long haul. So they're listening, and they have, those pictures that you have seen, we have used them extensively with policymakers at international level and at local level, and they do have traction. But, yeah.
And there was also a question from Oksana about the training for interviewers,
yes,
and the methodological question.
Okay, so we were really fortunate in the Sarita project that we have Australian colleagues in global health who've worked an awful lot in this space, who came over to Europe to train everybody. So we all met and basically talked us through all the things that we had to, think about in terms of how we identify respondents. So we do not work with respondents if they have children with them, which is often the case. Even children as young as 2 can pick up on these conversations about ensuring that the respondents we work with are not in any counselling or therapy, who are kind of, because that would interfere. And looking at, there was 65 pages basically of, these are things to look out for, to avoid, how to protect people, making sure that if anybody becomes distressed in an interview, stopping immediately, giving them time, asking them if they want to continue, shall we stop now? And, being prepared to just chuck the data away. Are you sure you still want us to use this data? And so on. Constant checking in. But also a lot of the work is around the interviewers themselves, limiting the number of interviews. And I can tell you with PhD students, you tell them to be careful, and then they whip off to the field. I've got 3 weeks to get all this field work done, and they do a crazy amount of really traumatic interviews in 3 weeks. They survive that because they're going, and then they come back, they read it, and that's when it gets really difficult. So we tried to get them to engage in psychological support that we set up on a weekly basis. And once they get really stuck in, they don't do it. So beforehand, they do. So I've really been rethinking about that. And when I did the kind of Welsh and the Scottish projects, and then Sandra ran the Ukrainian and the Polish projects, what we did is we actually organized discussions ourselves. We must meet weekly. We must have these conversations. And then they had to do it, or they felt they had to do it. And that was, I hope, more protective. But it's a really difficult space to work in. It's not for everybody.
Thank you. Maya? Yeah, and then Charlotte, yes. I'm talking about you.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. That was a very interesting presentation and really fascinating research, very important research, but difficult to listen to, of course, as well. I wanted to go back to ask, I mean, I have also a methodological question, but I wanted to go back to the question that Gabriella was asking, because I find that really interesting, sort of conceptually, to think about kindness in relation to the question of whether they have to be strangers or if they also could be people you know or could be connected to. And I thought that you made a really good point there about whether or not there's an obligation. And that you could see a difference there in terms of people who are working in different ways with these people. And I was thinking more generally there in terms of an important difference when it comes to expectations of other people and relations of reciprocity. You know, what is kind of expected and how that's conceived both in terms of the people who are acting in different ways, but also how it's understood from the person themselves who is met with kindness or not with kindness. And I was wondering a little bit more about that in relation to the interviews and how the actual interviews and the interview questions and how the data is analyzed in these sorts of terms. Because what I understood from what you were saying, these were kind of spontaneous things. You weren't asking specifically about kindness, but it was picked up as these. And I was just curious about, you know, how people make sense of their own experiences and whether it's conceived in terms of kindness. And of course you could, you know, understand it in terms of and analyze it in terms of kindness, even though people themselves haven't used the word kindness. But I just wondered that, whereas whether there might be lots of, you know, similar kinds of actions that people around you, people you know, people you're close to, also do to help and support you, but you don't think of it in terms of those, in terms of those terms. Do you see what I mean? That the kindness kind of stands out and can be conceptualized as something quite specific, precisely because it's not expected. And it's something that stands out in your story as well. Does that make sense? So I guess my question is kind of, yeah, it's just a reflection around that. But also, what did the interviews look like in terms of this? You know, what were the questions that were asked? Were they very open? Was it just sort of driven by their own interviewees' own narratives? Or did you kind of prod specific themes and so on? So just a little bit more maybe about that.
Okay, there's a lot going on in there.
Sorry. Yeah.
Which is fine. No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, you made some really good points about expectation, I think, which I'd like to sort of take away and think about. I mean, it's certainly the case that after years of degradation, expectations are extremely low. So, you know, some things that happen are experienced as, you know, incredibly important because they are so extraordinary, even though they might be, you know, banal everyday things in my terms. We didn't look for the word kindness, okay, although some people would use it, potentially. The question that was asked here is, you know, has anything helped you? And often that would spark something going off in multiple directions. So, you know, faith would be raised. My faith has helped me. God has helped me. My kids also come up, you know, the fact that I've got children, I've got something to live for. Sometimes they would talk about, you know, a caseworker. And then other times they raised these incidences of kind of stranger kindness, which to them were certainly unexpected. Nobody expected those things to happen. And perhaps, you know, I mean, I certainly do need to consider a bit more about that. The opportunity for reciprocity, I'm glad you mentioned reciprocity, because actually, I mean, all the work of kind of Maus and you know, looking at how relationships are formed, you know, the importance of reciprocity. And I think the thing that's lacking here is the opportunity for reciprocity. So, you know, I talked all along about those uneven power relations. And that's how they remain whilst someone is the recipient of kindness but doesn't have the opportunity to reciprocate. And where I mentioned Gabriella Davino's work, where she's starting to develop that is looking at how reciprocity is beginning to happen between the community sponsorship volunteers and the refugees that they're supporting, and how this is building a different kind of relationship in which they are able to respond and care. Oh, she got sick, she had COVID, you know, so I helped her, I did her shopping, that kind of thing. And that's when things even out a bit more. And I suppose what you would hope is over time that people wouldn't notice acts of kindness because they're just part of the everyday messiness of living as part of, I don't know, a community, a group, in a place where people muddle along together and help each other out. But certainly the issue of expectations, I might have a think about that and see where it fits. And we don't ask about it, but, you know, maybe in the future.
Thank you. Were you finished, Maya? Yes. So Charlotte.
Okay, thank you very much, and for this important study. And I thought about, when you thought about this micro level that could turn to a macro change, and then I thought about the motives also for being kind, and related to what is seen in research about the voluntary engagements, the sector where values are important, but also other different kinds of things. So it but values. And then I thought, how could we foster our children to be kind, to resist? I think that was, I mean, in our society, and as parents, as teachers, as to resist when people are not met, seen as human beings, people. So honest. Yeah, I just thought that was, and these people who are kind, have they been? That would be interesting to see how were they fostered in their schools, through their families, through religion, or through, could that, like a kindness revolution. For fostering.
Difficult question.
I guess that is done in all religions, in all, I mean, in all societies. But it's,
I mean, obviously I don't know the answer, so that goes without saying. And certainly it's important to find an answer. And maybe the answer's already there in this area that I found. Well, I haven't found it, it's out there, but I stumbled into it, never having seen it before, of positive psychology. So maybe the answer is there, I don't know. I don't know what the motives are in the Sarita, work for being kind. I really have no idea. It would appear from the stories, and don't forget these are second-hand stories based on people's recollection, that it does relate. Well, I'm absolutely convinced the first stage is noticing, and not everybody notices. So it's being attuned to, as gosh, I can't remember the name of the author now, but as they say that, like the vulnerability of others. So it's picking up on that. And I think someone talked about, is it a personality trait? Maybe it is. Maybe you've got this heightened sensitivity to others' feelings. Although, quite frankly, I'm just thinking of like Senate at the border, you know, in Hungary, clearly suffering, everybody turning away from her. She actually described how she begged women to help her, and these women literally just turned away like she was an animal. You know, she was filthy. And, you know, this other woman doesn't. You know, she does the complete opposite. In fact, she expressed her sense of Senate's vulnerability in the most emotional way possible through crying. You know, so clearly there are differences there, and you know, where they come from, I don't know. The thing I do know is that we did a huge amount of work on community sponsorship in the UK, which has helped shape the community sponsorship programs of Europe. So it's been really very influential from a policy perspective, which I wish I could say that for the Sarita project, still trying. But the thing that comes up there is, you know, the kind of values and motivations of volunteers. And sometimes these are humanist. Other times they are, well, quite often they are based in religion. So, you know, and we had a lot of volunteers saying to us, you know, in my religion, I am supposed to do things for others. And I've never had an opportunity to do this before. Now, of course, there's a big issue there about, is that you being selfish because it's your opportunity to, you know, to kind of express, to enact your religion? Or is this a genuinely altruistic event? I don't think so myself. But anyway, I'm perfectly happy that they're doing it. So, you know, I think the whole values thing is really important. But there's a huge amount of opportunity. I don't think on journeys. Journeys are really difficult. You know, borders are difficult places, and they're messy places, and they're dangerous places. It'd be really hard for us to do this kind of research there, or to dig out the kinds of women in Libya who are rescuing, you know, women off the streets and nursing them. We can't do that, but we could be looking at the kinds of things that are happening in Sweden and UK and Australia, and trying to understand who does them, why they do them, not volunteers, but these kind of random acts, you know. So there is scope.
Yeah. And of course, it's
not easy.
interesting also, I think, with reference to the climate, who you should be kind to, etc. So there is more work to be done here.
Oh, loads.
I think, Maja, you want a follow-up on that, and then Ylva.
All right, okay. In that case, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just thinking about this question now about kind of values and what it is that make certain people be kind in certain situations than others. And I think one reflection is just about context and the environment and how different people are positioned differently, because it can also be a strength of, you know, of power and a, you know, kind of a position where you feel able to express kindness, as opposed to others who might be extremely frightened and you know, be held back by a hostile environment, who would like to, who feel empathy, but who are unable to take the step between empathy and the act of kindness because of the oppressive structures. And I'm just thinking that there must be such complexity around people's ability to act and the resources that people have in that context. Yeah.
Good point.
I can only agree.
Yes. Yeah.
Short answer for once.
Okay, thank you for a really inspiring and engaging lecture, although difficult topics. But I just wanted to turn the perspective to like the design of your study, that you actually have these countries that you focus on, Turkey and Sweden and Australia. Because I'm interested in like the within and between cases, differences and similarities, if there are, because you also said that one reason we focus on Sweden is because there is a strong welfare state with gender equality as an important policy issue. So where are there differences that emerged, or because you presented, your presentation was a lot framed as like a united pattern, or were there these banal cases of kindness, were they more evident in certain countries, or vice versa?
Okay, just to say that a lot of the kindnesses didn't happen in any of those countries. They happened on the journey, and the journey sometimes took in many different countries. But we saw examples of stranger kindness in all of those countries. And in that respect, I think there's a certain process that may be happening, this kind of noticing, feeling, and then acting, that can work in any of them. Looking at Sweden, the biggest difference there was Sweden was definitely held out as the place where people were more likely to be kind because they pitied you, because they felt you were an oppressed woman. That kind of maybe related to some of the thinking around, gender relationships and, the privileging of certain kinds of ways of living and so on. So that was evident, and that was mentioned quite a lot in relation to Sweden. So some people have had really positive experiences in Sweden, really positive. I was carrying my child down the street because I didn't have a pushchair, and someone just came up to me and gave me a pushchair, and it really changed my life, as it would, but the same person could say, but sometimes these Swedish women, I think that they're trying to get me to, they believe I'm wearing my headscarf because my husband makes me, and they keep saying to me, if you do this, then you can take my head, and they pity me. And that's why they're nice to me, because they're trying to get me to push back against the kind of gender depression that's associated, or that they feel is associated with, they self-describe as Arab women. So that came out in Sweden more than anywhere else.
Is there something else we could say about the selection of these cases?
Yeah.
So the country, the cross-country.
Okay. In the first instance, we wanted one common factor, which was that they'd all had some kind of response to the refugee emergency of 2015, 2016. But what happened was, yes, we did a lot of work around that, and then our attention was drawn, particularly in the UK, to the dreadful situation of what was described to us as sub-Saharan African migrants, which has subsequently became a bit of a bigger theme across the projects, but just really wasn't relevant to Australia, but did have some resonance in Sweden. So we chose Australia because it's predominantly resettlement, refugees in Australia, with a very tough stance on anybody who claims asylum within country. We couldn't go anywhere near the camps in Nauru, and although these are largely winding down, nobody's been able to get into those spaces at all. But some reference was made by service providers, and that was of interest to us. In Turkey, it was very much about choosing somewhere that was really, like kind of massive scale investment. I mean, the huge amount of money that Europe has put in there, but a place that's both of transit, but also ended up being a stopping point for people that don't necessarily want to be there. So a place from where one might seek resettlement. Sweden, very much interested in this kind of very strong welfare state, and particularly, a particular way of acting around gender and gender relations and how that's privileged in welfare policy. And in the UK, the combination of resettlement, asylum, and the hostile environment. Tunisia is just kind of, this is the place. No one's supposed to be in Tunisia. It's a place you pass through and get chucked back out into. And it's really not geared up in any way for refugees or asylum seekers. And that was part of Sandra's study. So,
thank you. Christopher had a question also.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I'm trying to formulate this as a question. I guess it's puzzling me also, like what can the strategies be for this? Because I guess you're not seeing like these spontaneous kindnesses are not really like the solution for all these 100 million refugees. But could it be like you also came in a little bit on the micropolitics of kindness, and as you have also met with politicians, because if we can see in Sweden with the refugees welcome, all these kind of movements, I felt it was like this massive, I don't know what to call it, but it was kind of a movement of kindness actually, and you can also could see that for a while it also affected politicians, like Stefan Löfven had this, we don't build any walls in my Europe or something like that. But then, of course, it came a massive backlash, and we have seen dehumanization of refugees, at least during my lifetime. This massive dehumanization, which I guess is the opposite of the kindness that you have seen. But could it be a politic of kindness or micropolitics of kindness as a more on a higher level when you meet with politicians? And I have difficulty to phrase a really good question on this, but is this something that politicians can use, or is something that scholars or activists can use through politicians on a higher level that is not only the everyday acts of kindness?
One of the things we've been trying to do is to move politicians in the way that we felt individuals had been moved in response to encountering someone's difficult awful situation. So we've actually tried to use those, those kind of values-based cartoons, and we've tried to use a little bit of storytelling. So when we presented at the House of Lords, for example, we actually confronted politicians with individual stories, lived experience, attendees who volunteered to be part of it, and someone who stood up spontaneously in the audience and said, "This is exactly what's happened to me. You've got to help us, you've got to help us." And after that, this confrontation with the, it's not being able to turn away again, the kind of actually having to face up to the reality of it because it's there in your face, had quite a positive response at that meeting. And so subsequently we have tried with these stories. We started our initial international work with a big event at the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum in Geneva. And someone who is very high up in one of the big humanitarian organizations, we called the report Nobody Helped Me. Of course, that's their job, isn't it, humanitarian organizations. And we started with, I think the orange graphic, and this very high up person stood up and said, I cannot believe this. I cannot believe what I'm seeing. Nobody helped me. That's our job. We must be helping. We've got to do something here. And this has kicked off a sort of chain of events whereby, Sandra's really engaged with that organisation, written these guidelines, and now we seem to be convening quarterly workshops to try to find a way forward. So I think in that way, yes, that perhaps there is potential. But I've also spoken to politicians who have clearly, they've done the opposite. They've totally zoned me out. I can tell. I can really tell when I speak to them, oh, that's terrible. Kind of there's no emotion in their voices. They're not okay. And they're like, oh, well, I could put you in touch with somebody. Not, you can see there's not the feeling response. So I think you do have to kind of generate those feelings. And, maybe that's what you need to do to get the move from the micro to the macro. But at the end of the day, this is part of something that's so much of a bigger picture. So I'm rambling a bit now, but I've just been reading Lucy Maebelin and Joe Turner on migration and coloniality, and they actually mentioned kindness once, and how in Europe we through our welcome movement, you know, we express these acts of kindness, but actually what we're doing is we're being so selective about the people that we allow through our doors, and we haven't taken account of the historical reasons why people live in conflict, chaos, you know, where climate disaster comes from, and we're picking and choosing those we decide to be kind to. And actually, we need to think much more about the overall geopolitical system and about the historical underpinnings of forced migration. So I'm not sure I mean, your question was not quite formed, and my answer is even less formed. But there are potentials there, but there's a whole big picture thing that hasn't really happened in this space yet, where we need to theorize around the historical underpinnings and the current geopolitics.
But that is a really good way, I think, to end this lecture on contextualizing and looking at this very, you know, important topic and hard topic. Thank you so much again, Jenny. I am sure everybody here will join me in sort of wishing you and your team the best of luck in influencing policy at various levels. And I know how hard you have worked with this. Congratulations again on this honor degree. And thank you everybody for coming, for asking good questions. And I suggest we put our hands together for a final time for Jenny. And thank you very much.
Thank you.